Listen to me. Your legs are getting heavy. You're too
Hi there.
slow.
I'm Jason Grindstaff, and if you're watching this video, you're probably doing so as part of a sports psychology class or a class on psychosocial aspects of movements, which combines sports psychology and sports sociology. We're going to primarily be drawing upon content from this textbook. It's Weinberg and Gould's Foundations of Sport and Exercise Psychology, 6th edition, but we might be also drawing upon some other resources in there as well. Today, we're going to be looking at an overview of sport and exercise psychology. And so we're going to jump right into chapter 1. And there's a number of key objectives that we want to look at with this chapter. There's 6 in particular. But of the 6, we're really going to spend most of our time today in this first video just on the first 3. And in particular, we want to be able to define sport and exercise psychology. We want to look at the 2 objectives of sport and exercise psych. And then finally, we want to look at, for those that are working in the field as sports psychology consultants or sports psychologists, what are the various roles that they might be working in? So what is sport and exercise psychology? Broadly, we can think of sport and exercise psychology as the study of psychological constructs that influence performance. And really, we're talking about performance of any kind. It doesn't just have to be sport. It can be in exercise context. It can be in the boardroom, military professionals, other public service professionals, the performing arts. So anywhere that individuals have to perform, those individuals can benefit from sport and exercise psychology. So when we say psychological constructs, what do we mean there? Well, we're really talking about a person's cognitions or their thoughts. We're talking about affect, meaning a person's emotions and feelings. And then we're also talking about behaviors, or those observable actions. More specifically, Weinberg and Gould defined sports and exercise psychology as the scientific study of people and their behaviors in sport and exercise activities and the practical application of that knowledge. And if we really look at this definition, I think there's a few key components. The first being scientific. It's the scientific study, meaning we don't just use introspection or kind of that analysis in our own head to think about what works for athletes and other performers. We use studies and experimental designs to evaluate empirically what are those psychological principles and skills that help athletes perform, and what do they get out of that performance. The second part of this definition, it is the study of people and their behaviors. So yes, we are interested in those, the thinking component and the feeling component of psychology, but we are also, at the end of the day, when it comes to performance, those observable actions or the behaviors. And then the final component of this definition is the practical application of that knowledge. So yes, it's incredibly important in sport and exercise psychology that we're doing research and we're furthering the body of knowledge in a field. But specifically, we really need to be interested in how does the acquisition of that knowledge, how do we apply that and help performers, how do we help them perform better at what they're already hopefully good at, and what are they getting out of that experience? We're also going to be looking at in this course kind of the sociology of sport. This class is psychosocial aspects of movement. So we are going to be drawing a lot upon sports sociology, which this isn't the textbook for this course, but as a supplemental reading, if you come across it, it's an excellent book. Jay Coakley is a world-renowned scholar and researcher on this topic, and he defines sports sociology as it's primarily a subdiscipline of sociology and physical education, which studies sport and social phenomena. And there's really 3 key components or 3 key terms that we need to be familiar with when we're studying sports sociology. And that's culture, social interactions, and then the social structure. So what do we mean by culture? It's the shared ways of life and how those understandings are experienced by individuals and groups of people. So maybe an example of this, here in the United States, we don't have too many residential training facilities where young athletes go and live. They get their education there and their sports specific training. However, in many Eastern European countries, it's not uncommon for some of the more elite youth athletes to go and live at these training facilities. And so not only do they get their sport training there, but they also get their education, they eat there, so they have access to nutritionists and exercise physiologists. That's not uncommon for that culture. It's just a different way of viewing sport. So we are very interested in sport culture. We're also interested in the sport interactions. And this is how two or more people behaviorally interact with one another and the exchange of that information and experiences. So when we think of, let's think of an example there for social interaction. Think of going, as athletes come into their freshman year. Could be high school, could be college. How those new members of the team are socialized into the team. Sometimes there's hazing rituals that go on, and sometimes those can be a positive sort of experience, fun and lighthearted. But sometimes there's also some teams have carried that too far in the past, and there's some real negative implications of that. So from a sports sociology standpoint, we could really study some of the social interactions there. And then finally, we look at social structure in sports sociology. And by social structure, what we mean, this is the patterns of relationship and the social arrangements that influence how people live, work, and play with one another. So here, a good example of that is, let's look at a team. Again, could be a high school team, could be a youth team, could be college, a professional team, doesn't really matter. Let's just look at a team or a group of individuals. When the members of that team or the players often have a subordinate role, and the individual, the power is oftentimes in the coaching position. So if players feel in this subordinate role that they can never bring concerns to the coaching staff, they never have input, this could create an environment where athletes don't feel like that they have any say, they don't have any autonomy, they don't have any influence on the team. So this could potentially lead to burnout. And so sports sociologists might take a look at how the structure of those groups affect the individuals and the group as a whole. Now that we've defined sport and exercise psychology, and we've also defined sports sociology, let's look at the two objectives of sport and exercise psych. So the first one being, we want to be able to understand the effects of psychological factors on physical and motor performance. Okay. So an example here might be, how does a catastrophic injury affect an athlete's confidence in returning to competition for the first time? If you've ever had an injury, you know that oftentimes a serious injury, you've probably physically recovered from that injury well before you've completely psychologically recovered. So a lot of times athletes, they'll have fear of re-injury. There's just a lot of apprehension in getting back into competition. There can be some real negative psychological implications of many injuries. So that's the first objective. So we want to understand the effects of psychological factors and how that influences performance. So if we look at just kind of the inverse or the opposite of that, the second objective is we want to understand the effects of participation in physical activity on those psychological factors. So we might look at psychological development, the athlete or the performer's health and overall well-being. So let's look at an example. So, how does participation in youth gymnastics influence the individual's overall sense of self-worth and self-esteem, identity, things like that? So important to keep in mind that we're not just using sport and exercise psychology to enhance performance, but we also want to see how participation in these in athletics and through exercise, how that can impact somebody's overall development, health, well-being. When we talk about, who can apply this information? Well, sport and exercise psychology certainly isn't just for elite athletes. Seniors, children, not just in sport context, we're also interested in exercise. That's a key part of sport and exercise psychology. For many that grow up playing athletics, it's hard to believe that you wouldn't be sports minded, but there are a lot of people out there that don't particularly enjoy sports, but do engage, do still engage in physical activity and exercise. And so we want to help those individuals as well get the most out of their performance. It is for elite athletes all the way down to the recreational athletes. For athletes with disabilities, coaches can benefit from sports psychology. The mental game of coaching is incredibly important. Teachers, physical educators, fitness instructors, those in those leadership roles can oftentimes utilize these principles. And then as well, another big component of sports psychology and the application of these principles is to business and even military. Performing arts, anybody that performs under pressure can benefit from sport and exercise psychology. And then finally, we want to take a look at some of the roles that sport and exercise psychologists. And so there's 3 primary roles that we're going to look at, and those being teaching, consulting, and research. And so let's break these down individually. So if we're in the research mode, here what we're looking at is we're looking to advance a body of knowledge. Many times researchers work for large organizations, maybe a government agency like the Centers for Disease Control, or maybe they work more so for an academic institution, teaching college classes, and doing research there, which leads into the next role of a sport and exercise psychology individual, and that is teaching. So though there might be research to advance the knowledge, we need individuals within the field of sport and exercise psychology to be training future professionals. And so there's a need for teaching, especially at the university level. I've even seen more recently that there are some high schools that are starting to offer sports psychology classes. And so there's a need for individuals to go in and teach these concepts. And not just in academic settings. We talked about just before how sport psychology concepts are being utilized by the military. So there's a need for individuals to go out and work for the armed forces and teach these concepts to our military professionals. And then finally, consulting. So consulting is where it's the direct application of that knowledge. And so here it moves beyond teaching to actually helping individuals perform more at a higher level, perform more consistently. And so here's where we kind of start getting into the direct application of that knowledge and going out into the field and working. Which does bring up our last component as far as specializations. And here I want you to be thinking of 2 different sort of camps. There's going to be a degree of overlap in what each group does. But here we have the idea of sports psychology consultants and then clinical sports psychologists. From a clinical background, let's break that one down first, if you will. So here, if you're a clinical sports psychologist, these are oftentimes licensed professionals. Might be a licensed clinical psychologist, licensed counseling psychologist, mental health counselor, social worker, more of a clinical background. And here, these individuals are going to work with athletes and other performers on a range of mental health issues. So maybe that's like eating disorders or substance abuse issues, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, those sort of things. But if we look at, for example, an educational sports psychologist, here this is where we might utilize terms such as sports psychology consultant, a mental training coach, a performance coach, things like that. And so here we're really interested in understanding the psychology of human movement and how to help people perform better at what they're hopefully already good at. And so from that standpoint, one of the goals is to help educate athletes, increase their awareness, help them build confidence, help them manage stress and anxiety levels, not just pre-performance, but also during performance. So there's a good graph or a good figure in your textbook, figure 1.2, that kind of breaks down kind of those two disciplines. So more on a clinical end, this is where we're talking about psychology, one of those clinical issues, and on the other end, more sports science sort of concepts. But it's important to note that even though these can be viewed as two separate entities, there's a significant degree of overlap between the two, because both those on the psychology side and the sports science side ultimately are interested in helping athletes perform, or other performers perform at a higher level. So I hope in this video you were able to, one, better understand how we define what is sport and exercise psychology, understand some of the questions that sport and exercise psychology asks. In other words, what are the objectives of this field? And then three, what are the roles that sport and exercise psychology professionals perform, and where do they work? So thank you for watching. And in the second part of the video, we'll hit up those last three objectives.